About Dr. Sherholtz, since I tend to think you are driven by data, and that's what's important here, are trapped in non-compete agreements. Corporations use non-compete agreements to hold workers hostage. It prevents them from either starting a competing business or going to work for another employer. So a worker who has a non-compete faces two bad options: stay stuck in a job that you really want to leave, or upend your life to break free from the non-compete by moving away from your current job, changing your career, leaving the workforce, or risking an expensive years-long battle in court. I believe that workers should have the freedom to switch jobs. They should be able to seek higher wages, better working conditions, and if they so choose, to start their own businesses. But big businesses want to control workers and stifle competition, even if it hurts our economy as a whole. Dr. Toussaint, if you had to sign a non-compete agreement when your medical practice was bought by a private equity company, and can you just say a little more? You talked about this a bit in your opening statement, but how broad this was. This was not a non-compete that said you can't go right next door and open the same practice under almost the same name. How broad was your non-compete? What all did it cover?
Thank you for the question. It's important to note that the private equity group at the time was located in 3 states: Colorado, Arizona, and Florida. My non-compete specifically said that I would be restricted from practicing orthopedic surgery within 25 miles of any facility in which they are doing business, any facility that they had previously done any business, any facility that they are currently targeting for expansion within the entire state that I am currently living in, which is Florida, and then any facility that they have had discussions with in thinking of acquiring in the future. And this would be valid for approximately 2 years. So we're talking 3 states, and in my specific location, at the time, I was one of 2 surgeons covering specialized treatment for over 850,000 people, most of which are within rural counties. Okay. I thought that was insane.
All right. So they have barred you, basically, from practicing medicine in any of these 3 states. And I detect from the way they wrote it, in case they were thinking about any other states, you would also be covered in those. But I take it was more than just a prohibition on going into private practice. When you were offered a job at a publicly funded academic hospital, what happened? Can you say again about what happened when you tried to accept that job?
Right. Unfortunately, as part of their agreement, they wanted me to give a copy of the employment agreement and non-compete clause to every employer that I was having a discussion with. Right. So that's essentially like a scarlet letter or basically a mark against me to say that if you want to hire this doctor, despite his specialized training, you're going to have to go through us. And we are in multiple areas across the United States.
Right. And so now let's talk about what go through us turned out to mean. In fact, you were able to go become a teacher of other doctors, which is obviously not a direct competition originally. So calling this a non-compete, it shows how much it is stretched out in terms of how much it restricts you from doing. But what was the consequence of the you have to go through us part of this contract? How did you ultimately end up going to work for the university?
Thankfully, the university and the community needed me more than they wanted me out of town. I unfortunately had to engage a number of community leaders, including the NAACP, and a lot of my patients to go and support me in this effort to be able to work. If I didn't do that, I would have to relocate out of the state, and I would have missed out on a number of collaborations within the university.
I just want to say, we talk about what happens to an employee who's stuck in one of these non-competes, but you have given us a perfect example of how those non-competes end up hurting communities, in your case, end up hurting patients, others that you serve. And in this case, I just want to underscore, communities are served now by the more than 37% of physicians across this country who are currently bound by non-competes. So unless you go through the person who owns that contract, these are whole communities that could lose access to the physicians that have served them so well. So you had folks on your side who were able to weigh in so that you ultimately were able to go to the university. Ms. Page, let me turn to you. Your former employer used a non-compete to keep you from designing wedding dresses, whether it was under your name or some other name. Can you just say something about what that meant both for you and for your brides?
Thank you for your question, Senator Warren. It was devastating and disheartening. I am in an industry that relies on an emotional purchase, and there is an authentic connection made when saying yes to the dress. And to have that tarnished or severed is almost as if we're putting a veil over what's really happening. And in my experience, it was truly difficult to imagine how you could communicate and make that connection to a bride if not only I couldn't express myself creatively in the way that I thought I could, but I couldn't even use my name or practice the trade. Mm-hmm. It was interesting, I think, too, from the business perspective, because we are a wholesale business and all of these stores had invested specifically in a designer collection. And so when the designer was no longer behind the dresses, they were affected. They felt the residual stress of, how do I explain to the consumer and the brides coming in the doors that this dress no longer has the Haley Page behind it? Mm-hmm. And obviously, when you invest that kind of money in your business and you're unable to sell the merchandise or feel ethically icky in doing so, it creates a really big void in the marketplace.
Right. So hard on patients, hard on brides, hard on the other small businesses that have built up around you and your brand, wanting to sell those Haley Page gowns. Can you just say one more word about it, though? I thought about when I first heard about your story, what it must feel like if you're a pianist and you're not allowed to play the piano, if you're a painter and you're not allowed to paint, if you're a wedding gown designer and you have been told you cannot make wedding gowns. There are other things you can do in life, but that has been crossed off your list for years. Can you just say a little bit about how that feels?
Yes, thank you for your question, Senator Warren. It was soul-crushing, but what's interesting about my case is that it was challenging my identity from 3 different factors. I was unable to use my birth name, I was severed connection to my social media community, and I was withheld from my trade. Of all 3 of those things that are extremely hard to wrestle with and digest, not being able to practice my trade was the most emotional and hard to overcome. And in that moment, I had realized how much of my identity came from my craft. Mm-hmm. And I think when you devote yourself to a craft, part of you becomes that craft. And it really did feel like a severing of who I was. And I'm so grateful, of course, for the support I received. But it was also particularly devastating to feel the confidence and the height I was at in my career. Not very many people can perform at that level. And that is something that should be celebrated. And as a woman who struggles with insecurity, to feel like you're really good at something, but you're not allowed to do it. And then you have these amazing women that want to see you do it, but then you can't deliver. It's emotional and devastating.
So, Dr. Sherholtz, you've just heard from 2 people who have lived through experiences with non-competes. Each of them have fought back, and they have mustered communities around them and been able to hit back. But talk just a little bit about the effect of these non-competes across our economy.
Yep. Yeah, the things that Ms. Page and Dr. Toussaint experience, they're just all too common. Non-competes restrict workers' ability for starting a business, for practicing their craft in their community, for taking another job in their community. And economy-wide, when you put the data to it, what you find is that reduces business formation, it reduces worker mobility, and then those things reduce productivity, they reduce innovation, they increase prices, and they reduce workers' wages. So we can see how this played out in these folks' lives. And then when you look more broadly at the economy, it's just incredibly harmful on all measures.
Well, I'm very grateful to you, too, for telling your stories, and very grateful to you, Dr. Sherholtz, for just describing and putting the context all across our economy. The Biden-Harris administration has taken historic action to ban non-compete agreements. And right now, it is fighting back against the Chamber of Commerce and these giant corporations that continue every day to profit off non-compete agreements. Now, one of the things I want us to turn to now, I'm just going to give myself a second round of questions here since I don't have anyone competing with me for this time. I want to talk about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing here and how it is a game changer to ban non-competes. By giving workers the freedom to move jobs and to start new businesses, employers are going to have to change what they do. They're going to actually have to compete for workers. Workers' earnings, we believe, will increase collectively by about $400 billion over the next decade, according to the FTC. A typical worker, it would be about $500 more that worker could take on. And the American economy will be more dynamic and innovative, with about 8,500 more new businesses and tens of thousands more new patents if people can get out of these non-competes and go out and either start their own businesses or go into business with someone else or work for someone else. We get this massive economic boom because the FTC has designed the ban to be extremely simple. It says no new non-competes at all. It's not fussy, it's not fancy, none. Existing non-competes can be enforced only for the most senior executives. So, good for workers, good for the economy, but big corporations are unhappy about this rule. So what they say is they could do a rule, but they want a rule that is narrower and more complex. More like Senator Kennedy was talking about on, well, maybe a case here, maybe a case there, but a lot of very complex rules about how to make that work. Dr. Toussaint, you struggled with a non-compete agreement in Florida, where you live, but Florida already has a law that says a doctor cannot be bound by a non-compete if, in their county, all the doctors in their specialty work for the same employer. So I can't think of a law more specifically designed to address your specific issue. Why didn't that law just permit you to get out of your non-compete without any further question?
Thank you for the question. Number one, it's important to realize that this private equity company was not based in Florida, and their tactic is to file suit outside of their jurisdiction and outside of my own jurisdiction. So the plan is to wage a suit away from where we both live and make it as long and as expensive as possible, to the extent that I would give up and I would walk away before a judgment is even rendered. And so a scenario like that, you can imagine that the doctor's resources would not be as sufficient as the private equity firm's resources, and they could run it dry. Even though eventually I might win, it's unclear if I would even last that long.
So part of the problem we've got here then is the litigation itself is expensive, and they have found ways to make it even more expensive. I take it, Ms. Page, that was what you ran into?
Precisely.
Yeah, just drive up the costs and grind you down into the dirt. So the threat of the non-compete is big and important. It's also a question of who's going to be on your side to fight this. Who had to pay your legal bills, Ms. Page? Who was there?
Unfortunately, I tapped out.
It's you, right?
Yes.
And Dr. Toussaint?
Same here.
You had to bear your own legal bills. So what the FTC has said is we're going to have a very simple rule. It's going to be a nationwide rule. You don't get to go sue in some other state and think you can avoid some local rule. But it's also the case that the FTC can enforce it as an unfair practice, which means instead of being out there all by yourself, you will actually have someone on your side. That's the idea behind this. Yes, I see you smiling, Dr. Toussaint. That sounds like a good thing. You know, I want to point out one more thing before we leave this, and that is that the FTC's non-compete ban is very popular. Polls show that an overwhelming proportion of Americans and a majority of small business owners support the FTC's rule. In fact, as you know, when the FTC is about to put a rule in place, it's still a proposed rule, they invite public comment. They got 25,000 comments on the non-compete rule. And I just want to say, not everybody sits around in the evening and says, what can we do tonight? I know, let's go do a non-compete rule comment on the FTC website. Of those 25,000 comments, 24,000 came from individuals and businesses who said, we want to have meaningful non-compete clauses. This is valuable to us. And many, many people went on the FTC website to tell their own stories, very much like yours, Ms. Page, very much like yours, Dr. Toussaint, to talk about just how challenging it was when they got hit with a non-compete and how many people just gave up. They did not have the money for lawyers. They simply could not go forward, so they stayed in really horrible jobs. At this point, I'm going to pause and see if Senator Van Hollen would like to ask some questions. Would you like to do that? Good.